Recently, I made a video where I showed a book that was worth up to $14,000, and it actually showed where there were Hebrew settlements and Hebrew towns throughout the interior of Africa, showing that Israelites actually migrated into the interiors of Africa. And there was a lot of comments. There was a lot of people that was saying that that doesn't prove that Israelites were in West Africa. Just because it cost that much doesn't mean it's the truth. And I agree. So I said, you can't go off of one book. You can't go off of, one historical book and, make an assessment based on that. You got to cross reference information. So that brings me to this book here, which is the interesting narrative of the life of Alada Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, the African. Now, this book right here is a very affordable book, and this was a brother that was enslaved in Africa. Matter of fact, him and his little sister, they both as children were kidnapped. They were passed through different hands and made it to the shores of West Africa, where he was put on slave ships. They were put on a slave boat and sent to the New World. First to the West Indies, then to America. Then from Virginia, he was sold to a ship captain where he worked in the Navy, in the Royal Fleet for a long time, and he became educated. But specifically, he learned to read and write. And once he was able to do that, he read the Bible and he started to realize and see similarities between his countrymen and the Israelites in the Bible as far as customs and rituals. And I'm going to get into that. So, this book is a first hand account. This book is somebody that actually went through the transatlantic slave trade, that was actually there. Let me say that again. He was actually there. He actually lived it. He saw it. He breathed it. He experienced it. This is not second hand. This is not third hand. This is a first hand account. So I want you to, go in when I break this down to you, go in with a objective mind frame, right? And just understand this is somebody that was there. We wasn't there. We in America, we wasn't there. But this is the brother that was there. And if anything is supposedly going to be credible, well, I would think a first-hand account should be credible. So I'm gonna get into the book and just follow along. So, of course, he was from Isaka, right? Which, to my understanding, is southern Nigeria. It says that he was born in 1745 in a charming, fruitful vale named Isaka. The distance of this province from the capital of Benin and the seacoast must be very considerable, for he had never heard of white men or Europeans. Remember, Benin in that area of the Ivory Coast, uh, New Calabar, Bani, those places were the slave ports. That's where the slave ports were at, and that's where a lot of uh, people left the shores of Africa going into the transatlantic slave trade. Now, I'm gonna get into some of the things that he said. Now, a lot of Equino basically went into slavery, right? And he went into slavery and he passed through different hands, a lot of different slave masters, and he got educated. Now, when he was living in West Africa, growing up and having the good life that he had in the interiors of West Africa, he didn't, or his people didn't know they were Israelites. But when he got educated, he started to, think about his childhood, think about how his countrymen were, and he saw distinct similarities between his people and the Israelites of the Bible. So I'm going to read some customs, some things that they did that you can find actually in the Bible. So right here he says, their mode of marriage is thus. Both parties are usually betrothed when young by their parents. This is an Israelite custom of betrothing, or, the parents giving away their sons and daughters, sitting down and making an agreement with each other. It says, on this occasion, a feast is prepared, and the bride and bridegroom stand up in the midst of all the friends who are assembled for the purpose, which he declares she is thenceforth to be looked upon as his wife, and that no other person is to pay any address to her. This is something that if we practice this, and let me just say, I want to say this is out of the Bible, right? This is a custom of the Israelites also. And if we did this in our time, in modern times, meaning if we gave away our sons and daughters, if we actually were involved in the lives of our children in this way, and we raised our children this way, we wouldn't have 70% single parent homes. We wouldn't have fatherless homes. We wouldn't have situations where people get married and break up. We wouldn't have situations where people have slept with multiple people and are still single trying to find their soulmate, because it would be a true courtship process, meaning they're not having sex until it is decided that they are actually going to be together. They just get to know each other for a time. All right, let me move on. He says, our manners are simple, our luxuries are few. The dress of both sexes is nearly the same. It generally consists of a long piece of calico or muslin wrapped loosely around the body, somewhat in the form of Highland plaid. This is usually dyed blue, which is our favorite color. You know, blue was the color that the Israelites were given to put on the borders of their garments, along with fringes, right? He goes and talks about his woman, about the jobs of the women. Everybody participated in agriculture at any given time. Everybody worked. There was no such thing as beggars in his community, right? And if the women wasn't working intelligent with the men, they were making garments, spinning cotton, and doing such things as that. He says that their manner of living was plain. The Bible also says that Jacob was a plain man. Now, right here, he goes into talking about the type of slavery they had, which was more like a servitude. And he starts out by saying that the prisoners which were not sold or redeemed were kept as slaves. But how different was their condition from that of slaves in the West Indies? So he makes a distinction between the type of slavery they had and the transatlantic slave trade. He also says that the slaves did no more work than regular people, than free people. The only difference was that they didn't eat with the free people, but they could also own slaves or servants. And that is also in the Bible, having servants, which people get confused with the word slave and servant. They get that confused a lot when they want to say that the Bible is okay with slavery. All right. As to the religion, they believe that there was one creator, right? That he governed, especially he governed deaths in captivity. So they felt it was one creator and that he was in control of death and captivity. Now this is a heathenist custom where they would put meat down here. They would put meat. It would serve food to the dead relatives, pour out a little drink like black people do, pour out a little liquor for the dead homies. That was a heathenist custom that they have, right? And that's understandable. Let me go. So right here, he says, we had many offerings, particularly at full moons, generally 2 at harvest before the fruits are taken out of the ground. So this is similar to first fruits in the Bible, which was an observance, a high holy day. And when any young animals are killed, sometimes they offer up part of them as a sacrifice. Young animals, meaning, in the case of the Bible, it would have been a lamb under 1 year old, right? So that's a key. That's another custom of the Israelites. These offerings, when made by one of the heads of the family, served for the whole. I remember we often had them at the fathers, and my uncles and their families have been present. Some of our offerings are eaten with bitter herbs. Bitter herbs. That's also straight out the Bible. To make the offering for the Passover and eat it in haste with bitter herbs. I'm just showing you these similarities that don't fit no other people. But this brother who actually was in the slave trade, who was kidnapped, him with his little sister as kids and went into the transatlantic slave trade. When he is now educated, he is relooking at his story and how he grew up, and he is realizing and seeing all the similarities in the customs that his people had, or his countrymen, as he say, with the Israelites of the Bible. He says, we practice like the Jews. We practice circumcision like the Jews, and made offerings and feasts on that occasion in the same manner as they did. Like them also, our children were named from some event, some circumstance, or fancy foreboding at the time of their birth. And if you know about circumcision, you know that that was definitely a practice that was that the Jews participated in, that was, you know, a part of the law, statute, and commandments, and also that brothers and sisters would be named after some event or some circumstance. He said his people were likewise the same. Right now, let me get some more. He says those that touched the dead at any time were obliged to wash and purify before they could enter a dwelling house. That is also law out of the Bible. That you would be unclean if you touched a dead body. You'd be unclean. I believe it was for 7 days. Every woman too, at certain times, was forbidden to come into a dwelling house or touch any person or anything we ate. I was fond of my mother, I could not keep from her or avoid touching her at some of those periods, in consequence of which I was obliged to be kept out with her in a little house made for that purpose till offering was made and we were purified. Now, what is this talking about? This is talking about when a woman is on her flower, when a woman is on her cycle. She was considered unclean for 7 days. Anything she sat on was unclean. The bedding, the sheets was unclean. And anyone that touched her was unclean. And naturally, a child is going to cling to their mother. So he was unclean, and he had to be out in the other house with his mom until that time passed and she was purified. This is laws out of the Bible, right? He says, such is the imperfect sketch in my memory has furnished me with the manners and customs of a people among who I drew my first breath. And I cannot forbear suggesting what has long struck me forcibly, namely the strong analogy which even by this sketch, imperfect as it is, appears to prevail in the manners and customs of my countrymen and those of the Jews. So he is seeing that all of these things that they do, and he's realizing like these things, these manners and these customs appear in my people and in the Jews. Once again, for the naysayers, for the people that say that, you know, the Israelites were not in West Africa, they didn't go in slave ships. You have a first-hand account from somebody that went through it. Now I wonder what people are going to say. This is somebody that actually went through it. Someone that actually got educated and then realized when he thought about his life and the way that the manners and customs of his people, that he could not let it go. And it struck him so hard that they're so similar to the manner of the Jews before they reached the land of promise, before they reached the land of Israel, meaning when they were in the wilderness. That's how he seen his people behave, and the customs reminded him of the Israelites in the wilderness, and particularly the patriarchs while they were yet in that pastoral state, which is described in Genesis. An analogy which alone, check this out, which alone would induce me to think that the one people had sprung from the other. Ooh-wee. Now let me just put a cut in there. He's not seeing him, he's not looking at his countrymen and his people and seeing customs of the Egyptians. He's not seeing, you know, customs of, you know, Ethiopia. He's not seeing customs of South Africa in his people. He's seeing customs of the Israelites in his people. This is a man that came through the transatlantic slave trade, that was captured, that was kidnapped while the workers and the adults of his community were out working. And he ended up in the transatlantic slave trade, just like a lot of black people or Israelites did. Let me go on. Like the Israelites in their primitive state, our government was conducted by our chiefs, our judges, our wise men, and elders. And the heads of a family with us enjoyed a similar authority over his household, which is ascribed to Abraham and the other patriarchs. The law of retaliation attained almost universally with us as with them, and even their religion appeared to have shed upon us a ray of its glory. Though broken and spent in passage, or eclipsed by a cloud with time, tradition and ignorance might have enveloped it. For we had our circumcision, a rule I believe peculiar to that people. We had our sacrifices and burnt offerings, our washings and purifications on the same occasions as they had. So right here, he's saying that the only thing that could have, disconnected them is that it could have been broken in the passage or eclipsed by a cloud, which is time, which is the time of how many hundreds of years had passed, where they had lost and forgotten who they were. Also in tradition and also through ignorance. All right. Stay with me. Now I'm going to wrap it up with this. Remember, I was saying, and let me just go, before I go here, let me just go here. Now, this book is called The Memoirs of Captain Hugh Crow, The Life and Times of a Slave Trade Captain, right? Now, this is something that stood out to me when I read this book. So bear with me. It says, the ship at length began to lie over, almost on her beam ends, and dreading that the blacks might be suffocated, though at risk of our lives, we permitted them to come on deck. Let me just catch you up. So it's a terrible wind. The seas is crazy. They're trying to leave a port, and the ship starts to fall over. And so they think that they're about to lose the ship and everything. So they allow the slaves that they are holding to come up on deck. Right. And right now they're on the shores of West Africa. Right. He says they at this time outnumbered us by more than 10 to 1. Our only dependence was on the good disposition of the 60 who we had shipped on the windward coast, who were of a race superior to those of New Calabar. What is New Calabar? New Calabar is one of the main places, and Bonnie, in the Bight of Biafra, the west coast of the Ivory Coast, where a lot of slaves left that port coming to the New World, coming to the West Indies and America. These were where you had like the people like the Dahomians and the people of Benin. These were the Africans that would go into the interior and raid and kidnap and war with other peoples and bring them out to the white man. They would caravan them out to the white man and sell them as slaves and trade them for musket guns and wine and things of that nature. What's heavy about this is he is making a difference between the cargo, meaning the slaves he has on board, and the Africans that caught them, the Africans that live on the coast. He sees a difference. Not only that, what I saw is that these slaves, they got out and helped them, and he said they were instrumental in saving the ship. So while they're on the ship going into slavery, they see that the white men are in distress. They come out from the bottom and help them. Meanwhile, that's exactly what happens in America. You see black people try to help their oppressor and try to stand by him and forgive him for the mass shootings and all of those things. Right. But that's another topic. But we're going to keep going. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to end it with this from a lot of Equiano. So now a lot of Equiano done got kidnapped. He done went through a couple of hands, and now he done made it almost down there to the shore. And this is what this is what he describes when he gets to the shore. He says, all the nations and people I had hitherto passed through resembled our own in their manners, customs, and language. But I came at length to a country, the inhabitants of which differed from us in all those particulars. So he came across other dark-skinned people in West Africa that were different than his people. He says, I was very much struck with the difference, especially when I came among a people who did not circumcise and ate without washing their hands. They cooked also in iron pots and had European cutlass and crossbows, which were unknown to us, and fought with their fists amongst themselves. Their women were not so modest as ours. You catch that? The women wasn't modest, meaning they probably didn't have clothes on. They probably didn't act like women. He says, for they ate and drank and slept with their men. But above all, I was amazed to see no sacrifices or offerings among them. In some of these places, they were people ornamented themselves with scars and likewise filed their teeth very sharp. Right? So even Alada is telling you that there were different people in West Africa. There were different people with different customs from his countrymen that did not look like his people, did not act like his people. We have a problem where we think that just because everybody comes from Africa, they are the same. Just because somebody has dark skin, they are the same. And nothing can be further from the truth. So after reading and listening to what Equiano said in his own words and how he expressed the similarities between his countrymen and the Israelites, and not only that, how he expressed how when he got around different Africans, different dark-skinned people, he saw that they were not similar, and he saw different customs, and he saw major differences. We can definitely see that just because you are dark-skinned or you came from the continent of Africa does not mean that you are the same. I feel as though because the way we are educated in the West and the way that they have taught us about slavery in our history, we tend to think that we're all unified on one accord, where there are plenty of examples of there never being any unity between dark nations. And we can look at the walls of Egypt just for that. You can go and look at the walls of the Egyptians and who their enemies were. They were other dark-skinned people or nationalities that they didn't get along with. So we have to get out of that, that trap that we're in from learning from white supremacy, our history, and thinking that, quote unquote, we're all unified simply based on the fact that we're dark-skinned. If that was the case, then people like Equiano, people like my ancestors wouldn't have not been kidnapped, wouldn't have been taken prisoner and carried caravan all the way to the shores of West Africa and sold to the Europeans. So we have to keep that in mind. Also, what you got to keep in mind is that this is a first-hand account. So whether you agree with it or not, you can't take away what this brother is recounting and how he grew up and what he saw, specifically those similarities that he saw between his people and the Israelites of the Bible. So let me know what you think about this book. Let me know what you think about this information. Give me your thoughts and your opinions. And with that, this is Black Authentic Truth.